Just as the libertarian order must always be on guard against bad, even if non-aggressive neighbors by means of social ostracism, that is, by a common "you are not welcome here" culture, so, and indeed even more vigilantly so, must it be guarded against neighbors who openly advocate communism, socialism, syndicalism, or democracy in any shape or form. These people, in thereby posing an open threat to all private property and property owners, must not only be shunned, but they must, to use a by now somewhat famous Hoppe meme, be physically removed. If need be, by violence and forced to leave for other pastures.
Okay, so the only thing that libertarians do more than infight is complain about how much we infight. At the risk of complaining about the infighting, I'm going to say that I don't think that that is a bad thing. We can learn from the various branches of the movement why they exist, how they see liberty, and we can end up as a stronger and wiser movement overall because of it. The clip that you just heard is from economist and philosopher and a whole bunch of other things, Hans Hermann Hoppe, a pretty controversial figure. And today we're going to be interviewing a guy by the name of Hoploo. He does some excellent animated YouTube videos and considers himself a Hoppean, basically a follower, as far as I can tell, of Hans Hermann Hoppe. Hoploo, how's it going?
Hello, thank you for having me on. It is going pretty well on my end.
Okay, good to hear. So, do you agree with the clip that we had at the start? The violent physical removal of communists and Democrats?
Well, I mean, what would you do if one of your neighbors said, I believe in the right to raid your home and steal everything you've got and shoot you if you resist? I think it depends on what you'd say about that, you know? Because that's essentially what...
How is that the same
because
thing,
that's
though?
essentially... Huh?
How is that the same thing? Like, if I'm... So I'm
Well,
just going
I mean,
around advocating for my right to vote for my leaders, and I just, I might even be a libertarian, and I just want to have a libertarian society by democratic means. I'm going around supporting the creation of some kind of government that's going to protect our libertarian rights. Are you really saying that it's justified to use physical violence against me?
Well, I don't know. Like, we could, say, have a discussion on whether or not threats of violence like that do, in fact, warrant violence. But the thing about, say, the democracy thing is that it's not necessarily creating a society based on votes and whatnot. It's basically saying that you believe in the establishment of a criminal gang of which will rob people, steal their stuff, and of course shoot anyone who doesn't comply. If you were to say, I believe in a mob, but a mob that you can vote for, how would that not be seen as different, or not as much? I believe in a mob, but more so, I advocate for a mob, which you can vote in, of which will break into your home, steal all your stuff, and shoot you if you resist, based on the fact that the rest of the citizens underneath the thumb of the mob had voted that it can in fact do so. How is that not basically a threat of violence, or a threat of promised violence?
Okay. So that's basically the kind of introduction that most people get to Hoppeanism. They'll hear something by Hans Hermann Hoppe or some meme related to him where he's advocating physical removal or something like that. So I wanted to throw us into the deep end there so that everyone who isn't familiar with the Hoppean worldview will get a taste of it the same way a lot of other people do, with the controversial stuff first.
Yeah.
So the next thing that I wanted to do is, so this series, Libertarian Infighting, is basically about, well, libertarians, they fight a lot amongst themselves, but like I said at the start, I kind of think this is a good thing. So I want to see why different groups of libertarians consider themselves libertarians and why they consider themselves different from the broader movement. So if I start off with just the basic question is, you do consider yourself a libertarian, right?
Oh, absolutely.
What is a libertarian?
Well, basically, a libertarian to me is someone who believes in private property rights and private property rights consistently. Uh, base. So basically, if you believe that, one moment,
Mhm.
like if you believe that people should be able to own what they've legitimately obtained, as well as, of course, their physical bodies, and of course can freely trade, associate, and whatnot with it, as long as, of course, they aren't bringing unwanted modifications, also known as harm, to other people's property and physical bodies. That this is basically okay. Whereas, of course, the opposite of libertarianism or statism is that you believe that a monopoly on lawmaking or monopoly on ultimate decision making in a given territory has the right to violate said private property for whatever reason. That's of course evil. I believe as a libertarian that violating private property is evil, and of course a state, be it a democratic or a monarchical or dictatorial or whatever state, sure, there may be more or less violations of private property under whatever regimes, but it's still evil.
Okay. All right. So that's a libertarian. Um, you're not just a libertarian, of course. You are a Hoppian. You support the fellow we saw at the start of this video. Um,
Heck yeah.
so, so what actually distinguishes someone as a Hoppian? Is it just a libertarian who really likes Hopper, or is there some specific views of Hopper that the movement of Hoppians, if you want to call it that, tend to hold as, like, if you don't believe this, you're not a Hoppian? What's central to being a Hoppian as opposed to just any other kind of libertarian?
Well, the funny thing about it is that there's really not that much different from or not that much of a difference between Hoppe and Rothbard's trains of thoughts and whatnot. So for example, they agree on almost everything. In fact, it's pretty much what really happened is that Rothbard passed on the torch down to Hoppe, just as of course Mises passed his torch down to Rothbard. Though obviously there's a lot more of a difference between Mises and Rothbard than Rothbard and Hoppe, like by a massive margin. However, I'd say that the reason why Hoppian as a term exists is because of the fact that Hoppe is in fact a controversial figure who I believes is very, very heavily misinterpreted, especially by Catoite, uh, Starwark,
Right.
quote unquote left libertarian groups, and as such, you gotta put a name to people who would dare point out the fact that, well, there is freedom of association is in fact part of libertarianism, and it's not just libertine culture. You gotta put a name to the people who believe such things, and of course, Hoppian or followers of Hoppe is what I believe they decided to choose. However, if I were to say that it did sort of evolve into its own ideology, that the basic prerequisite for it is, of course, obviously, um, number one, understanding Hoppe, and number two, agreeing with Hoppe on the major issues and whatnot. But I'd say that one important thing is, of course, argumentation ethics. You should probably come to libertarianism from argumentation ethics, or justify private property rights, or libertarian ethics with argumentation ethics,
Okay.
as that is basically Hoppe's biggest accomplishment. And obviously, no, I'm not saying that if you come to libertarianism from a different system of ethics than argumentation ethics, that you're a bad person or anything.
Hmm.
I just believe that it's the most efficient system to justify private property, libertarian ethics, etc.,
Fair enough.
etc., etc.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. So, a Hoppian at this point is just seeming to mean a follower of Hopper, which is fair enough.
Pretty much.
But there are a lot of views that Hopper has that are particularly controversial that I think, in my experience, I've seen Hoppians rally around more so. Like, for example, his contention that open borders are not actually libertarian. His contention that there should be I guess what he calls covenant communities. His physical removal thing, like we talked about at the start. If you were to say that someone was to agree with all of that kind of stuff, that the parts of Hoppianism that sound scary to outsiders, however, they don't agree with some of the philosophical underpinnings. Maybe they're not quite sure if they're more supporters of the Austrian or Chicago School of Economics. They don't really know if they buy argumentation ethics, but they do agree with Hopper on those more activist political side things, like the strategy, the scary bits. Would that person be a Hopper?
Yeah. Well, I'd actually say that person would just be sort of a plain paleo-libertarian, as opposed to a Hoppian mainly, and I'd say that's pretty fair,
So
I don't think people who'd... Huh?
I was going to say, so that puts paleo-libertarianism Hoppianism is a subcategory of it.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
And, paleo-libertarianism, it isn't, libertarianism, but gays get executed and whatnot, but it really just translates to old libertarianism, or basically what the old right was back in, H.L. Mencken's days and whatnot.
Right.
It refers to later Rothbard, or really just Rothbard throughout. He really didn't change his views that much, or fundamentally just expanded upon them. Okay. But paleo-libertarianism is not as scary of a phrase or a belief that many people like to think it is.
Right. Okay. I get what you're going with that. So the next thing that I wanted to bring up is Hopper also has a lot of controversial views on, I guess, the ideal model for social cooperation. He talks a lot about the dreaded straight white male of our time, and says that other groups should seek to emulate them, if not sort of just consider them to be the progenitors of the ideal social model. He talks very highly of that, and he's also had some alt-right sympathies that he's talked about over the years. Is that something you necessarily agree with? You think that there's something degenerate about homosexuality to society, or that there's something positive about specifically white people? What's your views on that?
Well, I think that everyone who knows me knows how much of a trad I am not. But basically, what Hopper really says about, say, the nuclear family, white European culture and its influence is not really a part of libertarianism per se, but more so an empirical thing. He points it out. He's just saying, that these things might just be true. And obviously, I don't agree with everything he says on that front, but I do have a lot of core ideas I do agree with. I do believe that a family unit, whether I believe it's strictly male, female, child, or whatnot, I don't know where I'm going with that, but I do believe that there are in fact empirical truths that he does say, and it doesn't make him more or less of a libertarian, and it certainly doesn't make him evil to point it out, or that he's a statist or anything like that. He's not. You're not a statist to point out that nuclear families are in fact an important part of civilization. You're not a statist to point out that historically whites have been dominant for various reasons. You're not a statist for pointing out the bell curve, IQ points, etc., etc. You aren't a state. It's like saying that you're a statist for pointing out that the Earth is either round or flat.
Sure.
Like, it's ridiculous.
Okay, yeah, it's an empirical claim. It's not a political claim at all. It's just saying how you think the world actually is.
Oh yeah, sorry. But like, also the thing about the alt-right and his sympathies to it is not the fact that he thinks that they're right. In fact, he very frequently trashes sort of statist conservatives like Pat Buchanan. He calls them conservative socialists. In fact, the infamous John Randolph group, which is, of course, the alliance between paleo-conservatives and paleo-libertarians, Pat Buchanan and Rothbard, he basically destroyed the group by pointing out the fact that the paleocons were essentially nationalist socialists,
Yeah.
But really, his sympathies with the alt-right are more so the tactics they employ. So they employ a lot of populistic tactics, which Hoppe says that libertarians should emulate more.
So, such as?
For example, just appealing to the demographics that are getting fucked over. Like, for example, the straight white male. He's getting fucked over by the state.
Okay, so
appeal to.
In what sense is the straight white male getting more fucked over by the state than other people, right? If the state taxes someone, I think as libertarians we'd agree that that's not a good thing, but everyone gets taxed. If the state throws someone in jail for some victimless crime like selling drugs or something like that, then that's bad, but not only white people get thrown in jail for those crimes. And in fact, if we're talking about the US, it's not usually straight white males thrown in jail for that. It seems to be disproportionately another demographic.
Well, yeah, I know that. He never said that we should downplay the happenings of other groups. In fact, I'd actually say he believes, or what I believe anyway, and I don't imagine he'd be too far from this view, that you have different populist programs for different things. So, for example, you say, hey, black people, look at how the state is fucking you over with the drug war and with the welfare state. Of course, the white, straight, heterosexual, or that's the same thing. But for that demographic, what you got to point out is, like, look at this. These anti-discrimination laws are basically destroying a whole lot of stuff. You're paying more taxes and subsidizing almost all other groups.
Okay. So
I wouldn't. It's more, again, it's not really a political or a philosophical thing, but more so a tactical thing, which you gotta appeal to different demographics.
Okay, that's
you
fair.
gotta. Yeah.
Well, okay, so if we're talking about tactics, two of the main things that I wanted to hit on, well, the first of the main things I wanted to hit on in this interview was Hoppe's position on borders. Because we've seen like Dave Smith's podcast recently talked about this, and there was a lot of hullabaloo about it. Not too long ago, Brian Kaplan released a cartoon book that you can read that advocates open borders, and he makes a lot of arguments as to why it's not only a libertarian thing, but something everyone should support. The borders position is really hotly debated right now. So, if I understand correctly, Hoppe's position is that open borders, is, while it might seem at first glance like the libertarian position, because, well, I mean, if we're against the government and the government's the one enforcing the borders, right, the government should stop doing that, right? Some person wants to come from Mexico to America in order to get a job. The guy whose place that they're going to work at, he consents to it. The Mexican worker, he consents to it. And the person who's going to rent the apartment to the Mexican worker, he consents to it. It's all voluntary, consensual interactions. Why should the government come in and stop that, if that is your view as a Hoppian?
Hold up. Sorry.
That's all good. So yeah,
Basically,
why should the government stop that? Why is that libertarian?
Well, basically, because the open borders solution is not that much libertarian either, or not that libertarian either. It's basically with sort of the welfare, anti-discriminatory, even drug war state. You have essentially a forced association with open borders and a forced disassociation with closed borders. So in essence, you basically end up throwing principle of what's status or not status out the window when you acknowledge that fact. I believe that fact has been
I kind of want to push you on
justified
it.
by.
I want to press you on that
Oh,
fact.
sure.
So how is open borders just simply the government not enforcing immigration laws, right? That which is the policy of open borders advocates, as I understand it. How is that forcing people to associate with that person? Like, consider the Mexican worker, right? Who is he?
Yeah.
Who is he being forced upon? Who doesn't want to associate with him? Who doesn't want to let him onto their property that now has to?
Well, obviously, so this sort of long-term solution, the state's gone or the state's severely reduced, and of course we're in Ancapistan or a libertarian social order. The solution is basically to just privatize everything and employ freedom of association. However, in the current day, where a lot of property is taxed and pillaged to pay for public lands, public property, public utility, etc., etc., etc. Basically what happens is that the incoming migrants essentially force themselves on to those lands and the government basically just allows them to do it, or if not invites them to do it. And you wouldn't, Dave Smith brought this up, you wouldn't really get too mad about a public school telling some crackhead that decided to make his way into the building to get out. You wouldn't really get so mad about that. So essentially, the whole question of is it libertarian or is it not libertarian for open or closed borders essentially goes out the window, and it gets more. You have to look at it more from a pragmatic ground,
Okay.
Maybe there isn't maybe there aren't these cultural and political problems with the demographic adjustments caused by the immigration system we have today. Uh, I believe that there is. I haven't seen much evidence to the contrary, and a lot of evidence for it.
Okay.
So essentially, as a pragmatic, from a pragmatic point of view, it's preferable to have closed borders, since the state has monopolized immigration control, than for the monopolized immigration control to favor open borders instead, and allow all these people to just pour in and into states that'll look the other way
Sure.
when they vote.
But the public property that these
Yep.
immigrants are going on to, right? I'm willing to concede that public property, those immigrants don't necessarily have the consent of the owners of that. But then the state isn't really the owner of that property. And if the state's not the owner and it's currently controlling it, doesn't that not make it unowned, and therefore the immigrants should be free to walk across it?
Well, basically, let's say that a thief steals, I don't know, half the value of a car from two people, not combined. For example, he steals from two people and the money he pillages goes to buy a car. It's not exactly that the car is unowned. In fact, half the car essentially belongs to, or the car essentially belongs to the two people who were victimized by the thief, who were stolen from. So if the car costs, I don't know, $10,000, and the thief stole $5,000 from each guy, they both own 50% of the car each.
Right, and the analogy
So
there
in
would be
essence,
to like a
the
road,
state,
right?
huh?
So, just to make sure we're analogizing this back to public property, the car in this analogy is like the road, right? We all got robbed by the state to
Yeah.
pay for that road, therefore we're all the rightful owners of that road.
Pretty much until it is one day privatized, in which case that's that. But
Okay.
as it stands now, it's not that the road is unowned. It's that it's basically the property title has to go to the taxpayers.
Sure. Okay, that makes sense. So, I'm totally happy about temporary, pragmatic stopgap solutions in the absence of an ideal situation. Like you say, this is just ideally we'd want to privatize everything, but in the absence of that, we have to admit that
Yeah.
a Mexican worker coming in to work for some American companies, sure, like the company consented and his apartment building consented, but did the owners of the roads, right? Did the owners of those public roads consent to it? Did
Yeah.
the owners of whichever other public service he's using, did they consent to it? And so there is some kind of trade-off. But once we're making
Yeah.
a pragmatic distinction and we're now saying, well, which one's going to cause the biggest property rights violation, that doesn't therefore mean that the bigger property rights violation is the one to the rightful owners of those roads, right? Well, because if we consider a lot of, if you look at Brian Kaplan's latest book, he has a couple of claims in there. I'm not sure if you accept them. That the amount of wealth that is lost because immigrants who want to voluntarily rent an apartment and work in someone's company with all consenting parties, the amount of wealth lost from those workers unable to do that because of the state's borders equals approximately the entire GDP of the earth. The most economists, some economists are more pessimistic, where it's maybe just another half Earth is lost because of those borders, and some economists will say, well, actually, no, it's about an Earth and a half. But we're talking about, if you think about it, those estimates do seem kind of reasonable if we're talking about the difference between the productivity of a person in a third world country compared to the productivity of a person in a first world country, even if they're equally productive as an individual, right? There's a lot more opportunities in a first world country. You're definitely losing a lot of wealth to that. So, first of all, do you buy that there's that much wealth being lost to immigrants not being able to get jobs where they most wanted, where the employers are willing to bid for them? Do you buy that? And if you do, doesn't that outweigh any negatives that are caused by the public roads being used without the consent of what you'd say are their rightful owners?
Well, firstly, I really find that claim to be a bit dubious. I'll have to look into it myself, but to the other thing, it's really not about how much of it's really just not about how much the private property owners lose, but more so what the private property owners want, So even though I may lose some of the value of my physical body by drinking Dr. Pepper instead of water, I still prefer having drank it in the short term to drinking water because I like the taste, I like the feeling, etc., etc. Sorry, I'm being a little twitchy today.
It's okay.
But,
I understand
yeah.
getting sidetracked about soda.
But but anyways, basically, if the private property owners say that no, we do not want immigrants on this property, well, that's up to them. Even if they could be wealthier for it, that doesn't really matter. And even then, I don't believe that they would, or that it would outweigh the costs. Because number one, a lot of immigrants actually get on welfare, especially in places like Europe. The Muslim migrant crisis.
Okay.
And
So-
you have to basically take into account the effects of demographic change in different cultures, voting habits, and whatnot. Because there's more to a society than people working. You know, there's more than to society than people just making wealth. You know,
Sure.
and if say there's a new dominant culture or a new dominant political bloc, because basically the Latin American or Central American immigrants are making what's said to be one of the biggest, if not the biggest, voting bloc in American history.
Yes.
You know, but you have to take that into account. What happens if they elect a socialist? What happens if they create a sort of gang culture or of no-go zones where like you'd have to account for that wealth being lost. You'd have to account for that greater violation of private property happening, And
Okay.
of course, obviously, if you can disprove or if you can prove to me that no, the uh closing the borders, stopping or restricting immigration, it creates fewer violations or less destruction than closed borders, which
Okay.
I don't believe. But if you can do that, well, okay, I'll change my mind. I just don't believe that
Okay.
anyone has.
Cool. So it's an
Um,
empirical claim. Then you're saying
yeah.
that in fact the greater property rights violations are caused by the open borders, and so therefore I go for the least bad of the possible things that the government could do with the borders, closing them or opening them.
Yeah, and like
Cool.
obviously there are some things short of privatizing everything to solve this migrant crisis. Like allow different states and localities to determine the immigration uh, solution or policy. That's the word I was looking
How
for.
is that more libertarian?
Create a sponsorship program, etc.
If
Like
it's
there are a
more,
ton
hold
of
on.
things you
If
can
it's
do.
if it's
Yeah.
more local, I just want to. How is that more libertarian? Right? Just being more local
Well,
doesn't mean it's more. That's not individual property rights. That's a smaller group being controlled by a state, but then it's more states, right? So it seems on net
well,
to be like that's more local does not mean more libertarian.
well. If we're going by the number of states, save zero, then it would be more libertarian to support a one world government. So I don't really believe that like
Well, I'm
a
not. I didn't
thousand
quite say
less
that.
powerful states.
I didn't quite say that.
I know I'm not saying you did,
Okay.
or I'm not accusing you of arguing of that. Sorry, but basically, it's preferable for various reasons to have a few, I don't know, thousand, 100,000, million small local city states
Hmm.
than it is to have a massive, massive evil global government, even though there's only one state versus a million states. And the
Okay.
reason why is not only ethical, you can imagine that there are fewer private property um, violations, fewer wealth destruction going on in the present, but in the future, you can generally be assured that more decentralized governance is going to produce less tyranny, less evil, etc., than a global government or a few giant nation states.
Okay.
You know?
All right. So I'm fine. Like I said, I'm fine with the pragmatic distinction there. I'm not sure. I'm not so confident myself, especially having read Brian Kaplan's latest book on open borders, that the greater property rights violations are those of the open borders, right? The forced association, like people, going on welfare and going on roads and voting the wrong way. Brian
Yeah.
Kaplan does make, I think, some good empirical arguments that it might be the other way around, that the refusing to let a Mexican worker work for a company wants to let him work for them. That is the greater violation of property rights, but obviously that's an empirical claim. It's not something we're going to settle here. But
Yeah.
I think the logical side of it I'm fine with. So let's pivot at this point, because it's something you brought up earlier on. It's argumentation ethics, and I think that'll be good to get into because it's
Ah.
something that is perfectly about logic. It's an entirely deductive argument, as I understand. So
Yeah.
I'm happy to give my outline of it if you'd prefer, but I think it would probably be better if you just gave us an introduction. What is argumentation ethics? You happy to go with
Sure.
that?
Sure. Like, I don't want to spend too much time on it for two
Okay.
reasons. One, I'm terrible at philosophical things like this, and number two, yeah, I think that there are a few other topics I'd want to get to, because like if
Sure.
I were to go into full detail about argumentation ethics, that'd probably take up like, I don't know how long the stream's gonna be, but probably the entire thing. But basically, the crux of argumentation ethics is that while most failures of a ethical system start with an is and try to get to an ought, because the is ought gap that's
Yes.
a philosophical thing. Argumentation ethics famously starts with an ought. Norms ought to be conflict avoiding, or be able to prevent or resolve or avoid conflicts over scarce rivalrous resources.
Okay.
And
And
of
how does
course,
it
obviously, the
derive?
norms must.
How does it
Huh?
derive that ought, though? How do you get that ought from
Well,
argumentation?
basically, because of the fact that when we argue over who gets say a scarce resource that we're conflicting over, as opposed to say using violence, we generally try to set up norms that will avoid future conflicts. So for
Hmm.
example, let's say that we are conflicting over an apple, and we're trying to figure out who gets this apple. So we argue and argue, and we come up with this system of, well, we'll just draw straws whenever there's a conflict over this in the future. You know,
Okay.
I don't believe that's obviously the proper conclusion of argumentation ethics, but that is a norm. That is sort of what argumentation. Shit.
So
I
that's a
might
norm.
have.
That's okay.
I might
So,
have derailed
but
myself.
that's okay. But basically, what I'm trying to get down to is, I can see that he's starting off with a Zort. He's trying to get to there has to be peaceful conflict resolution. However, at some point it comes into it that the reason that this is the case is that it's some facet of what it means to argue. As I understand it, it's something along the lines of the very nature of what it is to have an argument is incompatible with any ethic other than libertarianism. Would that be about right?
Pretty much. Like, basically, when you argue, you generally argue or try to create systems that avoid conflict. So if you argue for something or a system that creates conflict, you're essentially trying to argue against argumentation, which is performative contradiction, or in more normie terms, hypocrisy. Your actions are contradicting your words.
Well,
You
I mean,
know.
I want to distinguish there because he uses that a lot, performative contradictions there, and whilst it's similar to hypocrisy, there is a difference, right? A performative
Yeah, I know.
contradiction in philosophy is going to be like you say that I can't talk, and that's performative contradiction because it's not logically contradictory. There's nothing logically contradictory about the statement, but the fact that you're saying it means you can talk. So you are performing
Yeah.
something which contradicts, which demonstrates false the thing that you are saying. However,
Yeah.
in
It's
this
like.
situation, if I'm arguing against the libertarian ethic, it is true that I'm treating you as a person. I'm not trying to force you into anything. So I'm trying to convince you, therefore saying, well, you have ownership over your own body. You can do what you want with it. And to some degree, that's true, right? I am trying to argue with you and not force you. So doesn't that imply libertarianism? However, why is it the case? Why can't it simply be the case that that person thinks that that is the most pragmatic way to proceed? Right? It's not that they're arguing it not because they think that it's only right to settle things peacefully, but simply that settling things peacefully in this situation is the most pragmatic course of action.
Well, and I don't really think that means much, mainly because he's still arguing. He's still trying to create a system of ethics, or trying to establish norms. My bad.
Hmm.
Um, like I'm again, I'm like the worst on this. Like,
It's okay. We'll move on after this bit.
but basically, if someone say does not want to argue, instead just wants to use violence, bark orders, take what he wants, do what he wants, etc., and just forsake argumentation, that's just being an animal or an outlaw or whatnot. Um, ah, so in essence, if someone is only arguing on pragmatic grounds, but everywhere else he just does whatever he wants, he rapes and pillages, basically, uh, everything he says is worth shit. You know,
I mean,
you
it doesn't necessarily mean that everything he says is worth shit. Maybe he thinks that there is some norm, some ethic by which we should structure our raping and pillaging of others. That sometimes it is ethical to initiate aggression against other peaceful people. However, that's not always the case. And therefore, it would be totally consistent and not a performative contradiction for him to argue in such a way that does respect your autonomy, that does not initiate violence against peaceful people, does not violate your property rights, and does not violate any of the norms that Hopper's trying to derive. However, he may simply think that that's not always the way you should go about things. It just so happens that it is in this case.
Well, in which case he's basically arguing for norms that go against the purpose of norms, and the reason why is because Hoppe very clearly makes a case for why the only norms that could exist, well, logically, of course, is private property by means of filtering out norms that create conflict and as such go against the purpose of norms. So like he comes at that conclusion. It's even more confusing than it generally is.
Yeah.
But basically, to argue for rape is logically contradictory because you're essentially arguing for conflict. You're basically arguing that you shouldn't. You're basically just arguing against argumentation, you know. And
Okay.
like, I'm sorry, I'm
That's all good.
like really twitchy, hard to.
I understand that the autistic philosophy is not your favorite topic, and I totally understand. So I think I think I've established my qualms with that particular line. So we've been through some of the more controversial things Hopper's talked about, and we've been through the argumentation ethics thing. And you said that you had some stuff that you wanted to get into. There were some things that you'd rather spend time talking about. So what else do you think is important to talk about with respect to Hoppeanism?
Well, one thing I do like to always talk about, mainly because of how hilariously people misinterpret it on the gray and black side, is the topic of covenant communities.
Gray and black being agorists, the people who want to link the government with Bitcoin and buying heroin.
Yeah, basically, agorists have just a ridiculously stupid reaction to covenant communities, mainly because they cannot fathom that people would in fact voluntarily organize instead of being plain atomists and whatnot. But also because a lot of people on the more esoteric side generally tend to think for some reason that covenant communities are legal entities, you know, that they're these magical things that somehow have the right to violate private property because Hoppe said they could, even though that is in no way what he was arguing for at all.
So
with
covenant
the
communities,
concept of a covenant.
Covenant communities, as I understand it, is in the future when the state goes away, the proud race of Hoppians will get together and form little communities where they agree to do whatever they can to keep out people who aren't fellow Hoppians, and that's more or less a covenant community. Is that about right, or am I way off?
Well, basically, what covenant community is, like, quite literally translates to is community built on a promise or a contract, So basically, like, I'm going to establish a difference between civil governance and state governance. State governance is, of course, where a monopoly on lawmaking claims its territory and embarks orders at its citizens, and will shoot anyone who doesn't follow them, and will have a 50% chance of shooting people who do follow them. Yeah. Whereas a civil governance is something more voluntary. So, for example, a family is a form of civil governance. So, if if the patriarch of a family says that if you don't wear red, then you won't be invited to Christmas, and I'll leave you off the will, that'll generally influence the other members of the family to wear red in a voluntary, non-coercive manner.
Okay.
A covenant community is something pretty similar. Basically, it's where a collection of private property owners in a given area makes an agreement with each other on a code of conduct, And of course, if someone doesn't follow this code of conduct, they'll basically just disallow from their from not like the dissident's property, but from the covenant's property, uh, and just general ostracization, disassociation, etc., etc. It's basically it's how a homeowners association works, or even
okay, can I just pause there, because the homeowners association is an important one, because in homeowners association, it isn't quite as simple as they'd all agree to follow a certain set of rules and that have a contract and that's it. There would be some organization set up to administer that, and that organization would be. If that's the case within a covenant community, does that not seem worrying that such an organization would have inordinate power and could turn itself into just another government?
Well, like a state refers to something very specific, namely a coercive monopoly on lawmaking, or a monopoly on ultimate decision making, meaning that it is basically the judge of everything, including itself. If a covenant community were to turn into a state, I wouldn't deny that, or I wouldn't deny that being a possibility. However, I don't think that's inescapable or irresistible, But even then, covenant communities don't necessarily have to have a central, like, neighborhood council, or, like, for example, there is no end to how a covenant community can look. It can be a HOA, a trailer park, an apartment complex, a mall, whatever. It can be sort of corporate. It can be sort of traditionally democratic or majoritarian in the like private voluntary sense, not a I have the right to rape you because 9 out of 10 people said I could.
Sure.
It can be like sort of we pick our leader based on drawing straws. We pick our leader in a way that replicates however the Aztecs did it. I don't know. It's basically, I'd imagine that like a society based on covenant communities would be like this mosaic of wacky societies, and that's like my ideal of Incapistan.
So,
but like obvious.
I just wanted to pause you there, because my conception of anarcho-capitalism is more informed by David Friedman, less Rothbard. It's how I came into libertarianism. And those who are familiar with my channel will know basically what I think that looks like. I think that essentially it's a polycentric legal system with competing firms providing the service of rights enforcement, which, whilst at first it does sound like that's something that is not just a normal service that you could have on a competing market, I argue that in fact it is, that it's a private good, that there's no reason it couldn't be provisioned like any other service. That kind of polycentric legal system that I'm talking about, an important facet of it is that it is not a demographic monopoly, right? So there's no... It wouldn't be broken down into these different communities which each have their own security company, so much as it would be you could have a different security provider from your neighbor, right? The same way as you can have a different cell phone provider. And is that in conflict with the sort of anarcho-capitalism that you're espousing?
No, not at all. Like, obviously, some covenant communities can double as insurance agencies. However, I don't imagine that a lot of them would, you know?
Okay.
Or maybe there's like this opt-in program where you can live in a covenant community and it can provide an insurance, but you don't necessarily have to take it, you know? You can have your own,
So the covenant community would not have any enforcement. It would simply be an agreement between people that they will enforce to the extent that they decide to enforce it.
Well, basically, the enforcement is that you don't get to access the covenant community's properties, you know? So, for example, if the covenant community owns the roads, neighborhood, or utilities, you don't get to use them if you're not part of it, you know?
Cool.
It's not like they get to break down your door and force you to sell your house and move out with the threat of violence, but more so, they will generally encourage you to move out by cutting off your power, or by no longer inviting you to the Christmas party, or by banning you from the local stores that they own.
Right.
You know?
And
So
I'm thinking that you can see why Hoppeanism seems to be considered a little bit scary by a lot of other libertarians, and especially by non-libertarians. That it seems a little, that it seems a little related to. That a lot of people would say it seems related to fascism. And whilst I think that is obviously too far, you do see how it's. There is some way that it sounds culturally repressive when you're saying, well, you know, if we're going to have this agreement between everyone in society to not use violence, but to use social pressure and that sort of thing, to try to force everyone to live in a similar way. Doesn't that... Do you at least see the connection there?
Well, I wouldn't, like, for example, I would say that at first it can seem a bit eerie, but when you really think about it, there'll generally be sort of two types of communities. One very basic ones that just say, you know, you can't play loud music at 11. You're going to wake everyone up. And if you do that, the community is obviously going to punish you in the way it can. And the other type of community is a gimmick. You know, so Christian covenant community. They follow Christianity. Sharia community. They don't chop your head off, but they'll... stop inviting you to the I don't know if Islam has a Christmas or Hanukkah equivalent.
Yeah, the Muslim Christmas. Whatever that is.
Yeah.
Ramadan? Is that it? Ramadan?
I'm
is
not
that culturally
sure.
sensitive
I don't know
enough?
about many.
Maybe I've just said something really bad. Anyway, okay, I think I get where you're going.
Yeah, or
with that, it's.
But at the same time, you can of course have like countercultural, LGBT, furry, sort of like reenactment, sort of a reenactment of historical societies. I don't know, nudists. There's no end to what you can do with covenant communities. And furthermore, I'd say that basically all of these sort of like quote unquote natural monopoly, which is actually no, it wasn't debunked by covenant communities. It was debunked right out the gate. But like the whole question of who will build roads in residential areas, that is very easily solved by just saying, well, people will form private associations and fund the roads that way, as opposed to thinking about how how a system of like having 15 million sewers running next to each other would be in any way practical. You know?
I'm seeing this like gated communities, where gated communities pay for their own roads a lot of the time as well.
Pretty much.
But if you've got these gated communities, those do have legal enforcement, right? They are like a legal entity, and there'll be some kind of a body corporate usually which will own the roads. So is this covenant community that whichever entity is administering this community, right? Is the council or whatever you've got there for the body corporate, whoever's you've got there, they're now they now control those roads, right? So does that mean it's their roads? It's the owned by that specific body corporate? And if that's the case, then isn't that a little bit worrying that you're gonna end up that's going to turn into a territorial monopoly of enforcement?
Well, there are two things for this. Number one, obviously, I believe that this model is very profitable or very easy to work with, and that it will be prevalent. However, it could be just as much the case that a community owns roads and public utilities jointly. So if you move in and you have signed the contract, you get a share of the stuffs. But really, I don't believe, like, for example, if a covenant community turns into a mafia, there are plenty of ways that can, of course, allow the citizens of it to take that administration to the gallows and correct them.
They could, but I mean, hold on.
I,
That's the same argument that the American founders used about the heads of state, right? Is that the tree of liberty must be watered by blood periodically or something like that? Obviously, I'm butchering the quote, but
I know.
You get the idea. They said, well, we'll just behead them. We'll do a French Revolution on them. Obviously, that doesn't seem to be sufficient. It seems like things can get pretty goddamn bad before a revolution happens, simply because the cost of a revolution for everyone involved is so high.
Well, there are two things about this. Number one, a covenant community will probably not be as big as the United States and the various state governments are. And I don't mean like I'm mainly referring to in terms of territory. So obviously, a revolution, basically a revolution that takes place in a street corner, is a lot less costly than a revolution that takes place in Texas. However, the other thing is that a covenant community, until one day it decides that it's going to coerce its customer with guns and be the judge of its own contracts, it's still a private entity, and it's not really easy for them to turn into a dictatorship or whatnot. But like, basically, if the people decide that, okay, these assholes are going a little too far, or okay, I think that these assholes are about to become a mafia, what will generally happen is that they'll hit them right where it hurts, also known as the profits. They'll move away. They'll liquidate and just run.
But wait a minute. How is that different from the statist argument that you'll always get when you say when they try to say that the state is voluntary because you can always leave? Sure, you can leave, but you'd have to liquidate all your assets and stop associating with everyone you know.
Well, mainly because, all right, that's somewhat of a good point. However, the difference is that a state does not have a claim to its land, and the state is the ultimate arbiter. If it wasn't the ultimate arbiter, where it judges all things, including itself, then wait, where was I? Shit.
It's all good.
Basically,
the state is not the rightful owner of the property it claims, and there I'd agree with you. That is a difference in what you're saying. You're saying that these covenant communities will only be considered owners of property that has been that they have voluntarily purchased, or that they've actually made use of that from a state of unownership. Right? They'll essentially homestead or purchase all of their land, whereas the states simply say everything within certain distance of here or behind this line is mine. That being said, that's an ethical difference.
Yeah, I
It
know.
doesn't seem like a
That's
pragmatic difference. So pragmatically, isn't it still worrying to have these covenant communities? Shouldn't we using the word that you used before, shouldn't we atomize a little bit more than that to avoid centralization of power?
well, I would say that there is a way to like atomize covenant communities in a way that they won't be able to get that powerful. You know, like I'm not arguing for. I don't believe that there will ever be a covenant community the size of like basically just the average state in America. You know, much less the entire union. But more so that covenant communities will either be just a neighborhood or maybe at most a private city, you know,
Okay.
or a private district of a city, you know. Like
So
obviously, like no, I would not trust a covenant the size of Texas. Like I would just say, nah, I'm not living there, you know.
okay. All right, you might not say that, but it
But
still seems you're opening the door for them. I mean, okay, let me put it this way. You're in a covenant community that's the size of a town. However, the next town over, there's some kind of an idea that you can merge these two covenant communities, and it can thereby have, I don't know, some kind of collective bargaining power in some way, bidding for piping or road use or something like that. And
yeah,
that argument could be convincing to the people within the community, right? Isn't it? It seems that there is an incentive for these covenant communities to merge. There's a reason that they'd want to. Isn't that a
well,
problem?
if they say that they or if they think that they can get more value or more wealth by merging, you know, like absorption and whatnot. Okay, like I like for example, maybe there are cases where it is in fact safe for two communities to merge, you know. Um, but obviously if it were to be too much, you know, like uh, I don't know, I don't know how communities would be able to merge into the size of Texas before it's too late.
Mm.
But like basically, if the people are displeased with a community, it will hit the administrators or the owners of that community or its public infrastructure much, much harder than it would a state, you know? Even
Okay.
a city state, you know, because a city state, they still technically have the right to pillage people. However, if the property owners of a covenant or in a covenant decide that they're fed up and that they're just gonna boycott it, that's like a direct hit, you know.
Okay. Yeah, I understand what you're saying.
Like, and even yeah, and
Um.
like
Well, I,
for
I, I do
example, I'd say.
I do think that
Oh,
you're
go ahead.
right, and to some degree that given the way that these were set up, maybe it's hard to. Maybe the worry about them merging is not not necessarily that large, but it is still, I think, a worthwhile worry. That being said, I think we've basically gotten through the main things I wanted to get through, and we've got one of your own. What I was going to suggest, and you can say no if you want, but I was going to suggest we jump back into one of the other channels here, and some other people who might want to ask you some questions or talk would have the
Oh,
opportunity to
sure.
do so. Are you keen to do that?
Sure.
Cool, great. So let's jump into the parking building. We might get a couple of other people in my Discord server, which you, too, watching at home, can get access to by becoming a Patreon and giving me money. All right, let's jump through. Okay. So I'm also going to switch into the band. Maybe someone is going to jump in pretty soon. But for the moment, we'll just continue where we were at. So we were talking about covenant communities, right? The covenant communities, why do you think that they would be prevented from merging? Like, what actual incentive is there to keep them small? Because I have identified at least one incentive for them to increase in size. What's the counter incentive? And just to preempt that, you're going to say, well, people will just leave. I think that the people, in that case, they'd simply have to merge slowly enough such that the cost of people leaving would be lower than the problems caused by that merger.
Well, one thing I did want to sort of point out, but didn't get the chance to as of yet, is the fact that sort of the same argument would kind of apply to, say, a private security force. What happens if they get so large and start extorting its members, or they get so large they get so many guns that they decide to infest a neighborhood and become the local mafia, you know? And like I believe that there obviously there's a possibility for that. However, there are of course various market forces as well as direct competition that would prevent that from happening, you know? So if you have a red force who decides to become the mob, well, guess what? Blue force, that's a boon for them, because not only are a lot of red force customers going to probably be going over to them, but they're going to have an increased value or an increased demand to correct red force, you know?
Okay.
And
All right, fair.
yeah.
Okay then. So that kind of makes sense. All right. So if we get away from covenant communities for a moment, I think we've done that topic to the death. Is there another part of Hoppeanism that people should be aware of? Is there something else that he talks about that is part of that core message that would be like the difference between someone being a Hoppian and not?
Well, one thing I wouldn't say makes you a Hoppian, or I wouldn't say it does or does not make you a Hoppian, but it is something that he likes to point out is the the difference between a monarchy and a democracy, or why a monarchy is not in fact worse than a democracy, but a democracy is in fact worse than a monarchy. You know, like obviously, I don't think anyone here is an idiot and believes that Hoppe supports monarchies or sees them as anything other than just state. However, he believes that a monarchy will generally produce less horrible decisions or less short-run decisions, you know, like taking on debt or proposing a program before establishing how he can fund it, you know, which is what basically every Congress and Parliament on Earth and through history has done, you know. A monarch who has basically direct ownership over the capital of his country, obviously for unethical reasons, but to where like sort of where the country is de facto his private property, even though it obviously isn't. You know, like monarchs are thieves and rapists and murderers and whatnot. I'm not disputing that. However, he owns the country as if it was private property. You know, so
Yes.
if he takes on debt, that's essentially his debt. It's coming out of his personal fortune as well as the fortune of his heirs. Whereas you don't see AOC talking about paying for the freaking Green New Deal or taking it out of her salary. No, no, no. That's just for everyone else who pays taxes
Yes.
to pay for, you know?
Okay, so there are
Yeah.
some situations some reasons that a democracy would actually be worse than a monarchy. I'm willing to
Yeah.
concede that. However, aren't you just ignoring the ways in which the opposite is true? Right? So a monarchy, there seems to be less incentive for them to actually do some things that people want, even if voting as a method of expressing what you want is terrible, and I think that it is. It does
Yeah.
impose some incentive on the rulers to do what people want, or at least what they in the voting booth kind of think they're gonna want. Right? That's
Kind of like
absent.
Pascal's wager.
Yeah, that's absent. Aren't you like? How do you know? If you're going to say that monarchy is better than democracy, how do you know that the positives of monarchy outweigh the positives of democracy, as meager as both may be?
Well, basically, the fact that people wanting something doesn't always mean that is like sort of economically beneficial, you know? Like demagogues and people who promise these short-run policies, my evidence for this being the popularity of Bernie Sanders, Tango, Yango, etc., etc. Where basically all these politicians, pundits, etc., etc., they promise these short-run things for the voters, and that essentially means that the voters or the populace, quote, wants these things, and as such, that's that's not necessarily a good thing, you know. Whereas
Sure.
a monarch, if a monarch decides to institute a program, he's gonna take what's the long run effect of this gonna be into account, not only because it's his personal fortune, but it's also what his heirs are gonna have to deal with. And even if he is
Yes,
like an abusive father and he hates his heirs, that he has to put some consideration into them. Otherwise, they're just gonna assign someone to remove the head from the body. You
but
know?
hold on, because it is true that the monarch is going to have be better in terms of time preference, right?
Mm.
That the monarch is going to use. He's going to want to plan for the future. He's going to want to pass stuff on to his heirs, etc., etc. And democracy, you know, the guy's in there for one short term, so he's going to have to loot as quickly as he can and then split. So that's fair. However, what is he going to have time preference about, this monarch? He's going to have time preference in terms of. He's going to have low time preference in terms of his preferences for himself. He's
Mm.
incentivized to still loot just as much as he can without people turning on him. So that
Yeah.
doesn't seem like it's so great. You can say, yeah, he's going to plan for the future. Yeah, he's going to plan for the future in such a way that he can maximally benefit, not that anyone else can, not that the people he's oppressing can.
Yeah. And like obviously, well, the like the response to that is that's how the state works, you know? Like that's just this that's basically the state. It's not that these problems with statism are eradicated or even mitigated under a monarchy, only that these problems are not only not escaped with a democracy, because you know the people with a low time preference in a democracy are of course the establishment. You know,
Yeah.
they don't they obviously have low time preference for for the worst of things. You know, but the point is that they're a monarchy is less bad. You know, like basically the point Hoppe makes with the whole monarchy versus democracy thing is not only to disillusion people about democracy, but also to point out that Whig history is full of shit. You know,
Whig history, can you define that?
basically it's the whole like progressive idea of history where things just get better over time and it's assured it's inevitable that we're going to have democratic socialism, just as it was inevitable that we were going to have constitutional republic, and it's just the flow of history, you
Hmm.
stupid libertarians,
That
you know.
sounds. That sounds okay. So the Whigs I associate with the early American Whig Party, whereas the
Mm.
thing you're describing sounds almost like Marxism, right? It's just like that he
Oh
thought of
yeah,
himself as a
Marxism.
scientist. He thought of himself as, oh, I'm just a scientist telling you how history's going to go. It's barely even advocacy.
Yeah.
I'm totally detached and scientific. That sounds like Marxism. Why is it
Hey,
called Whig
where are you?
history?
Hey, where do you think Marxism or the Marxian history theory came from? You know,
Okay. All
but
right. Um,
basically,
I want to just open this up to the floor now because I see that a couple of people have joined us.
yeah, yeah.
We've got Jim Jesus, we've got Tucci, Pipsqueak, and Volga Capitalist. I saw Pipsqueak saying something in the. So he tagged me in one of the other text channels. So, Pipsqueak, do you want to voice that out loud? Maybe?
Yeah, sure. I'd just like to make the point that you said that in a democracy, the elected officials have an incentive to do what the people want because otherwise they won't be re-elected. That's I disagree with that, because if everyone except a single person refuses to vote because they don't like any of the candidates, whoever that one person votes for will win. And correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of at least the US presidential race is that if literally every single person in the country refuses to vote because all of the current candidates on the ballot are terrible, the US Congress elects the president, which is essentially the state electing its own head of state. And nobody gets any say of, you can't vote for empty chair, is my point, basically.
Right, so they can rig that system by just only giving you two options that they both approve of. Right, that you can't really vote because,
yes,
both of the politicians that they're offering to you are in the same club, which it appears, that is the situation in most democracies right now. Is that basically what you're getting at?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, yeah, I think that's fair. I have for a little bit of this been playing devil's advocate. I'm not a Hoppian. I don't agree with him on enough stuff. One of the things is the Austrian economics thing, but that would take too long to get into.
Yeah.
But I do agree with Hopper on quite a lot of stuff, it seems, and especially after talking to Hoploo so far. All right, did anyone else have something they wanted to throw in there? Let's just take a look. Sorry about the dead air.
I do understand his point about the monarchy potentially being a better option than democracy, but I still don't think that option is literally any better than a democratic state anyways, just because bottom line, in a monarchy they have full control over every single individual, instead of individuals at least being able to have some sort of input on what happens. Now, America doesn't live in a democracy. We live in a republic. So it's like, it works quite a bit differently. But I just don't know that necessarily democracy or monarchy are either better than the other.
Well, basically, imagine, like, for example, the thing about a monarchy is that while it has, has no sort of political incentive to not be as tyrannical as it could be, there is sort of like, I hate to say market incentive, because in no way is a state part of a market, but something similar to that. There's this kind of preference for monarchs. Monarchs have to not run the country into the ground and institute tyrannies that would, of course, annihilate the social fabric and whatnot, leading to their inevitable guillotining, as opposed to where was I going with this?
Yeah,
basically,
the monarchy has some incentive to do the right thing because they could get guillotined. Is the short version?
Yeah.
Well, so does the American government. So.
Oh no, the American government.
Citizens are allowed to own firearms. That's. You can carry that out a lot quicker than a guillotine.
Like, here's the thing about. I agree with that. Guillotines are fucking trash. Helicopter master race. But basically, like, the thing about like guns, or like you're saying that a system of government is better based on a specific policy as opposed to the form. Like, for example, obviously an Islamic monarchy is gonna be fucking evil. It's gonna be disgusting. It's gonna be horrible. However, an Islamic democracy is assured to be worse, because democracy is often by default worse than a monarchy. And obviously, like, for example, obviously a democracy that is 100% libertarian is in the present better than a monarchy that is Islamic tyranny. However, both states will degenerate less, both states will degenerate at a different rate, and the fact that one's a monarchy and one's a democracy is a pretty big influencer in that.
Okay.
Like, that's the point.
Let me throw something on top of that, though, because since we've been talking about this for quite a while now, it's probably worthwhile throwing some empirical reality into it. Is it the case that the more libertarian societies tend to be the monarchies? There are, I believe, some monarchies left, or at least there's some places that say they've got kings and queens. I'm not talking about like the UK. I'm more talking about like Saudi Arabia. You could argue North Korea. It's a dynasty of a hereditary dynasty. Even though they say they're democratic, like. So there are some hereditary dynasties, and they don't seem to be the freest places, do they?
Well, the thing about, say, North Korea and Cuba is that, well, they are definitely dynasties. They're more so, like, for example, dictatorships are not necessarily monarchies, you know? Like, for example, a dictatorship is more akin to a democracy in sort of the bureaucratic structure and whatnot, because, you know, North Korea is not, like, if you actually examine North Korea and Cuba, they are not exactly, Kim and Castro's personal fortunes, as opposed to, I don't know, some Central European province in the 1500s, you know? However, one thing that should be pointed out is that monarchies took on significantly less debt than democracies, and total war, you know, one of this really ridiculously evil concept of a total war was developed in republics, as opposed to even Oriental monarchies in sort of the Iron Bronze Age. You know.
Okay.
Like, those are two facts that I believe have enough empirical backing that I would throw out. But like, I'm sure you know the Austrian position on like empiricism and whatnot.
Yeah, I know. You guys not so big on looking at, reality. But I love you guys. It's all okay. So for those who aren't aware, by the way, I don't think we ever got into it, is that Hoppeanism is also a subcategory of Austro-libertarianism, I believe, because Hoppe is considered probably the foremost living Austrian economist, and he's...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and so the Austrian school, which treats economics as a purely deductive system, that's kind of built in here, I'd say. It might be telling that it didn't come up during the discussion, though, because if it didn't come up during the discussion, is Austrian economics really crucial? Could I be a Hoppian without being an Austrian? I'm a Chicago school... I guess I did bring that up at the start. Could I be a Chicago school Hoppian?
Well, I'm gonna pull up the whole paleo-libertarian thing again. Like, for example, I actually consider freedmen. Sorry, my nostrils. I'd actually say that freedmen or Friedmanites or Chicagoites could, in fact, be paleo-libertarians. However, I believe that to be a Hoppian, you need. I'd say that being an Austrian is like, obviously not
pretty central
for anyone listening,
yeah.
But I'd say that Austrian economics is pretty central to Hoppian philosophy, you know.
And maybe on a future interview, I might find someone who wants to just come on as an Austro-libertarian and debate the whole Austrian versus Chicago thing. But I think I want to stick to Hoppe's more controversial stuff. Yeah. That being said, I do want to throw it back open to the floor, seeing as how we've got a whole lot of people who have joined. So does anyone else want to say something? You can just literally speak out. Don't be shy.
All right. While we're on the topic of Hoppe and monarchies being better than democracy, Hoppe never actually argues that the logical next step towards a libertarian social order is monarchy. In fact, I think he has an essay called "What Must Be Done," where he argues for secession. Right?
Yeah.
That's
awesome. We aren't gonna be getting any closer to libertarianism by replacing the executive branch with, I don't know, the Queen of Hawaii. You know.
No, cool. Wait, isn't that Tulsi Gabbard? She's the Queen of Hawaii, right?
No, I think they still have a queen. It's just sort of like the same thing. Anyways,
I do think he'd be okay with
seceding into a monarchy, right? The social order that takes place after the place secedes could be a monarchy if it keeps moving towards a libertarian social order after that. So, for example, there was one interview he did for an Austrian TV show on Brexit, and he said that he'd be very thrilled for an Europe of 1,000 Liechtensteins instead of an EU.
Yeah.
Essentially.
Well, Liechtenstein is pretty cool. Liechtenstein is relatively based, so that's maybe not a bad argument.
Oh yeah, like obviously, no, I agree with pretty much everything there. I actually don't believe that monarchy is that viable to recreate for a long while at the very least, and even then, I don't. Obviously, monarchy is still not very good of a system, you know.
Okay.
But like obviously, yeah, I agree that like recreating Liechtensteins all over the place is definitely a very good step in the right direction. Another thing I would like to point out is the fact that anyone on Twitter who is like sort of a reactionary, quote, alt-rightist kind of that kind of crap and calls himself a monarchist. They are in no way a monarchist. Let me just say that.
Okay.
They do not. They do not believe in the medieval or even like 1500s, 1600s Renaissance mode of governance. They just want some dictator with a fucking crown.
Yeah.
They just
fair
want
enough.
socialism run by someone wearing a golden hat. You know, like so.
The golden
Obviously,
hat does
you should.
look a lot better, though. Like, kings did look a lot
Yeah,
more
I
boss
can't
than, like, Stalin in his weird military uniform.
Hey, if you put whatever the Korean monarchs had on their heads back in the day on Kimmy, hey, I'll respect him about 0.01% more. You know,
Wow. Well, okay. Well, I'm sure he's going
maybe
to do it now. He
0.001.
wants that. He wants that .01 from Hoploo. All right. We've got a whole bunch more people in here because it's getting up to about an hour and a half. So I want to see
Yeah.
if anyone else has anything else to throw at the poor Hoppy in here.
Oh yeah.
If we don't, then that's all good. We can just cut the stream there. Obviously, we'll give Hoploo a chance to wrap up.
Okay, so Hoploo, when is your next esoteric debate?
Repeat.
When's the next time you're debating esoteric entity?
All right, that's very perfect to close off on. If I were to be interested in doing so again, it'd be after he makes his damn video on Hoppa.
Yes.
You know. Till then, I'm not speaking with him. You know.
Okay.
Till you outline whatever your convoluted problems with Hoppa are, in a video, I'm not dealing with this crap. You know.
Yeah.
This is one of the first two words.
All right. So, where can people find you if they want to hear more of the brilliant thoughts of Hoploo?
Well, I have a YouTube channel, which there's about a 1% chance of me uploading sometime soon. It's of course just Hoploo, and of course there is my Twitter account. I'll just say the political or the main political one, which is at Hoploo1. And of course, if you're a degenerate, you can find the alt in the bio. Yeah. Also, I can give you a link to my Discord server if you want.
Oh, awesome. Well, I've also chucked a link to your channel there in the description there. So do you want me to also throw an open Discord invite link to the public in the description or something?
Sure, I'll get you a link.
Okay,
quick.
Cool. I'll put it up as soon as the stream ends. All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming. Unless there's any last minute questions, in which case you can talk over me. But otherwise, thanks very much everyone for watching, and I'm going to see if I can figure out how to turn this stream off. While I'm doing that, I'll basically say that I'm looking like I'm going to be doing a few more of these. This was a lot of fun. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And also give me recommendations for who I should interview from various subgroups of libertarianism. All right, ciao.